There's this particular kind of quiet that follows a truth you never wanted to hear. A cold, heavy silence that settles deep in your bones and makes you question everything that came before. It's what hit me that night, at our 7th anniversary party, when Caleb, Clara's best friend, said it. He leaned in, a little too close, a little too confident, and told me, almost casually, that Clara only picked me because he was unavailable. I laughed, actually laughed, for maybe 5 long seconds. It was a nervous, disbelieving sound, because what he'd said was so utterly ridiculous. And then the laughter just died. Because Clara, my wife of 7 years, standing right there, didn't say a single word. Not a protest, not a denial. Nothing. For years, Caleb had been a constant. A fixture. He was at our wedding, every holiday, knew our Netflix password. He even had a drawer at our place for his clothes, for nights he crashed after going out. Everyone called him family. So did I. Never questioned it. Our anniversary party was a blur of 40 people crammed into our apartment. I was playing host, the dutiful husband, while Clara, in this stunning red dress, worked the room. Caleb showed up with expensive champagne, already loud, already a little too touchy with her. It was that way he had, the way I'd trained myself not to notice. Standing too close, whispering things that made her laugh, leaving me feeling like the third wheel at my own celebration. Later, around 10, I went to the kitchen for more ice. Caleb followed. He leaned against the counter, that smile on his face that never quite reached his eyes. That's when he started in, telling me I was just the backup plan. How Clara had wanted him, but he was tied up with someone else back then. When I asked what he meant, he just laid it all out. How Clara used to be in love with him. How I was the easy option, the guy who didn't require any effort. How the timing just wasn't right for them. She picked you, he said, because she needed to prove someone would pick her. The way he said it, so sure, like they'd discussed this version of events, made something cold settle in my stomach. The next 2 weeks, I started seeing everything differently. Like a film running in reverse, replaying scenes with new context. Clara texted Caleb constantly. She had this old shoebox of university photos, and he was in way too many of them. He'd walk into our place without knocking, like he owned it. During movie nights, he'd sit closer to her than I did, taking up space on our couch like he belonged there more than me. When I finally, carefully, suggested maybe we could see him a little less, Clara snapped. She said I was being controlling, called him her brother, accused me of being insecure. She made it sound like I was the problem, like noticing was worse than what I was noticing. So, I backed off. I tried something different. Pulled back. Gave her less attention, less warmth, just to see if she'd notice the distance. She didn't. Not for days. And that told me everything I needed to know about where her focus really was. After that, Caleb started showing up even more. Sunday dinners, random weeknights, joining us for movies on Wednesday like he'd been invited. He'd grab our throw blanket, settle between us on the couch, making himself comfortable in ways that should have bothered her, but somehow never did. I stopped saying anything. Just kept a mental list of every boundary he crossed that she didn't enforce. Then, one Thursday, I came home early from work. Forgot files I needed for a meeting the next morning. 2 cars in the driveway. Living room lights on. I walked in quietly. Found them on the floor, surrounded by old photo albums. Caleb was talking about some night they remembered, asking if she recalled when they thought they'd actually end up together. Clara laughed. Really laughed. The kind of genuine sound I hadn't heard from her in months when she was with me. I made a mistake back then. We both know I did, Caleb said, leaning closer to her. She didn't say no. Didn't shut it down. She just sat there, looking at him like he'd said something profound, instead of something that should have ended their friendship right then and there. I stepped into the doorway. Forgot my files, I said. Nothing more. They jumped apart like teenagers caught doing something wrong. Caleb mumbled an excuse about showing Clara old university memories. Clara's face went crimson. I just walked past them to my office without another word. 20 minutes later, she knocked on the door. Started with that line people always use when they're about to gaslight you, telling me it wasn't what I thought. I just said, okay. Didn't argue. Didn't demand explanations. I already knew what I'd heard, what I'd seen. That night, after Caleb left, Clara tried to act normal. Asked about dinner like nothing happened. But I couldn't stop replaying his words, her silence, the way they'd been sitting so close on our floor, our memories spread around them like he had equal claim to our history. That weekend, I started going through our shared photos, really looking at them for the first time. Caleb was in 70% of our couple shots from the last 5 years. Always positioned between us. Or with his arm around her, grinning at the camera like he was part of the package. Our vacation photos. Our Christmas cards. Our birthday celebrations. He'd inserted himself into every major moment. And I'd just let it happen because Clara said he was important to her. Now I was seeing it differently. Seeing how he'd slowly moved from the edge of our life to the center of it. How she'd made space for him that should have been mine. I found her old college yearbook buried in the closet and flipped through it. Exactly 3 pictures of them together, always in group shots, never looking particularly close. Whatever story Caleb was selling about their grand love affair, the evidence didn't match up. That's when I realized he wasn't just crossing boundaries. He was rewriting history. And Clara was either believing it, or pretending to believe it, because the attention felt good. I grabbed his stuff from the drawer in our hallway. Threw it all in a garbage bag. Left it by the door. Clara asked what I was doing. I told her I was making a decision she should have made years ago. That same night, I told Clara I was going to stay at my brother Kevin's place for a few days. That I needed space to think. She panicked immediately. Asked me not to go. Promised she'd talk to Caleb about boundaries. I repeated the word back to her. It felt absurd, given what I'd witnessed. This isn't about boundaries anymore, I told her. This is about safety. She looked confused, maybe genuinely didn't understand what I meant. And that scared me more than anything else because it meant she truly couldn't see what Caleb had become, or what she'd allowed him to become in our marriage. I packed a bag while she followed me around the apartment, making promises that felt empty, saying she'd fix it, saying I was overreacting, saying everything except the one thing I needed to hear, which was that Caleb was completely out of our lives, effective immediately. The next morning, barely 12 hours after I'd arrived at Kevin's, Caleb sent me a text. Everything cool? Clara seems distant lately. I stared at that message. How quickly he'd noticed a change in her behavior. How closely he must be watching to pick up on shifts within half a day. This wasn't friendship. This was surveillance. And the fact that my wife's emotional temperature mattered that much to another man made me feel sick. I didn't respond. Just screenshotted it and started a folder on my phone. When someone notices your partner's mood changes within 12 hours, that's not friendship, that's obsession. The real question wasn't just Caleb's behavior. It was why Clara never found it strange that her best friend monitored her moods more closely than her own husband did. Kevin's wife, Sarah, suggested I talk to someone who actually knew Caleb before he became this fixture in our lives. Someone who could tell me if this behavior was new, or if I'd just been blind to it for 7 years. I started with LinkedIn. Searched Caleb's connections. Found his ex-girlfriend from 2 years before he reconnected with Clara. Her name was Maya. Her profile said she worked in marketing downtown. I sent her a message. I need to talk to you about Caleb and Clara. Kept it vague. Didn't want to sound crazy. She responded within an hour with just 4 words that made my stomach drop. Finally, someone noticed. We met at a coffee shop near her office in downtown Chicago the next morning. She didn't even wait for me to order before she started talking. Maya told me Caleb had been obsessed with Clara since college. That their whole friend group knew about it. That Clara had gone on maybe 2 dates with him before realizing something was off and cutting contact. But Caleb didn't accept that. He started showing up places Clara would be. Called her at odd hours. Told mutual friends they were meant to be together, even after she'd made it clear they weren't. Maya described an incident at Clara's dorm, where campus security got involved, where Clara's roommate filed a complaint, where the whole thing got messy enough that Clara transferred to finish her degree at a different school. I sat there feeling like the floor had disappeared underneath me. Clara had never mentioned transferring. Never mentioned any of this. And I'd been married to her for 7 years. Maya pulled out her phone and showed me screenshots she'd kept from when she dated Caleb. Messages where he talked about Clara like she was his property. Like their story wasn't finished just because she'd moved away. He told Maya that Clara was the one who got away, that he was just killing time until she came back to him. And when Maya broke up with him, he didn't even seem upset. Just said she wasn't Clara anyway. She told me Caleb had a whole folder on his laptop of photos he'd collected, social media posts, pictures from mutual friends, screenshots of her tagged locations. Maya explained she'd had his laptop password when they lived together. Got suspicious enough to look through his files before she moved out. Found organized folders labeled with Clara's name going back years. When Maya confronted him about it, he said she was overreacting, that he was just keeping up with an old friend. But she'd seen the way he studied those photos, like he was memorizing every detail. Maya said she'd warned Clara about it back then. Sent her a message about Caleb's continued fixation. But Clara never responded. And then years later, Maya saw Instagram posts showing Caleb back in Clara's life like nothing had happened. I asked if she still had any of those files. She nodded. Said she'd kept them because something told her they'd matter eventually. She airdropped me everything right there. Dozens of messages, photos of Caleb's collection, even a video Maya had secretly recorded of him talking about Clara at a party. Drunk enough to be honest about his plans to eventually be with her. I drove back to Kevin's place with my hands shaking on the wheel. Pulled into the driveway and just sat there, trying to process what I'd learned. Kevin came out, saw my face, and called his friend, Daniel, who used to work in private investigation before switching to corporate security. Daniel came over that evening with a laptop and a legal pad. Asked me to tell him everything in chronological order. We spent 4 hours building a timeline, starting from college and moving through every interaction I could remember. Every time Caleb showed up unannounced. Every holiday he inserted himself into. Every photo where he positioned himself between Clara and me. Daniel pointed out patterns I hadn't consciously noticed. How Caleb's visits increased whenever Clara and I had any kind of conflict. How he always brought gifts that were slightly too personal. How he'd started dressing similar to me in the last 2 years. He's not trying to be with her, Daniel said, tapping his pen on a cluster of dates. He's trying to replace you. Become so embedded that removing him feels impossible. We mapped out Caleb's social media posts and found he'd been tagging our location, our favorite restaurants, our vacation spots, building this digital narrative where he was part of our relationship, whether we acknowledged it or not. The next day, I drove back to our apartment. I needed to have this conversation face to face. Needed to see Clara's reaction when I showed her what I'd found. She was in the kitchen when I walked in, looked relieved to see me. Started to say something about missing me, but I cut her off. Did Caleb threaten you in college? Her face went completely white. And that told me everything before she even opened her mouth. She tried to minimize it. Said it was complicated. That his ex-girlfriend was just bitter and exaggerating. That Caleb had changed since then. I repeated the word changed like it was absurd, and pulled out my phone to show her the timeline Daniel and I had built. She looked at it like she was seeing a puzzle piece she'd been avoiding. All those visits and messages and coincidences arranged in a pattern that was impossible to deny. I told her Caleb knew where we were all the time. That he showed up within an hour of us posting anything. That he was monitoring us. And she'd been letting him. Clara's hands were shaking when she reached for the phone. Tried to explain that she'd thought he was just being a good friend, that she'd felt sorry for him after his breakup, that she'd never imagined it was this calculated. Maya sent me more files while Clara and I were still talking. Additional screenshots she'd found in old backups. There were subcategories in Caleb's collection. One labeled with Clara's name containing hundreds of photos organized by year and event. Screenshots of every comment Clara left on social media. Even saved copies of posts she deleted. There were notes, too. Observations about what she wore, who she talked to, what time she usually left for work at the insurance company where she'd been an adjuster for the last 4 years. I showed Clara the folder structure. Explained this was a surveillance log, not friendship. That this obsession had been going on since before we even met. She started crying. Said she'd broken contact with him after college, specifically because things got weird. But he'd reached out years later, acting normal, apologizing, seeming stable. She believed he'd moved on. Thought the past was past. Never imagined he'd been watching her the entire time. I asked why she hadn't told me about college. She said she was embarrassed. Thought it made her look naive. Didn't want me to think she had poor judgment about people. I pointed out that letting him back into our lives after that was the actual poor judgment. And she nodded, finally understanding what she'd invited back in. Caleb sent Clara a message around midnight asking if she was okay because he'd driven past our apartment and seen my car back in the driveway. I showed her the text. Pointed out he was driving past our place at midnight. That he was escalating. That this surveillance was getting bolder. Clara stared at that message for a long time before she finally said she needed to cut contact completely, that she'd been wrong to think boundaries would be enough. I told her she needed to be harsh about it. No soft language, no room for interpretation, because men like Caleb heard what they wanted to hear in any ambiguity. We wrote the message together. Short and direct. Telling him not to contact her anymore, not to come by, that their friendship was over. Clara hesitated before sending it. Said it felt mean. Mean keeps you safe, I replied, and she finally pressed the button. Caleb's response came in seconds. A paragraph about how I was controlling her, how he knew she didn't really want this, how he had proof that she still cared about him. Then the calls started. One after another, for 15 minutes. We let them go to voicemail and listened to them get progressively more unhinged. The last one saying she was his, that I'd stolen her, that he was coming over so they could talk in person. That message made me grab my keys and tell Clara we were leaving. Going to a hotel for the night. Because I didn't trust what Caleb might do when he realized she was serious. She was still hesitating, saying maybe we were overreacting, when we heard someone pounding on our door. The pounding got louder. Caleb started yelling through the door that he could see the lights on, that he knew we were home, that Clara needed to talk to him without me poisoning her mind. I called the police while Clara stood frozen in the hallway, her phone showing 17 missed calls in the last 20 minutes. The operator told us to stay inside, keep the door locked, that officers were 7 minutes away. Caleb kept yelling, his voice getting more desperate, saying he'd been there for Clara when I wasn't, that their connection was real, that I was just threatened by what they had. When the police arrived, he immediately switched personalities. Became calm and reasonable. Told them there was a misunderstanding, that he was just checking on his best friend who'd sent him a concerning message. The officers separated us, took statements. One of them pulled me aside to say this looked like harassment, but without a pattern of documented incidents, they could only tell him to leave. They gave us an incident report number and suggested we look into a restraining order if his behavior continued. Caleb left, but not before staring at our apartment window. And I knew from his expression that he didn't consider this over. That night, we blocked his number on both our phones, changed all our passwords, including Netflix, locked down our social media. And I booked us into a hotel anyway, because I couldn't shake the feeling he'd come back. The next morning, we met with a lawyer who specialized in protective orders. Brought the timeline Daniel had helped us build, Maya's screenshots, the incident report from last night, and recordings of Caleb's voicemails. The lawyer listened to everything, made notes, and told us we had a strong case for a temporary restraining order that could become permanent after a hearing. She explained the process would take about 2 weeks to get the temporary order, that Caleb would be served with papers, that he'd have a chance to contest it in court about 3 weeks after filing. People like this often escalate when they're officially cut off, she warned. Document everything. Don't engage with him directly, and call the police immediately if he violates the temporary order. We filed the paperwork that afternoon. The lawyer said Caleb would be served within 48 hours. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. Kept checking the windows, even though we'd installed security cameras at our front door and parking area the day before. Changed our locks and told our neighbors and building manager about the situation. Caleb got served at his workplace 2 days later. And the fallout was immediate. He started sending Clara emails from different accounts, each one more manipulative than the last, saying she was making a mistake, that he had proof she'd led him on, that he'd show everyone the truth about our marriage. Then the fabricated screenshots started appearing. Messages that looked like they were from Clara, saying she loved him, that she was only staying with me out of obligation, that they'd been planning to be together. I showed them to Daniel, who examined the metadata and pointed out they were obviously edited, different fonts, timestamps that didn't match up, messages inserted into threads that didn't exist in the original conversations. Daniel explained how Caleb had taken real conversations and spliced in fake responses, building a counter-narrative to use in court to make himself look like the victim. We documented every fake screenshot, had Daniel write up a technical analysis showing the manipulation, and sent everything to our lawyer. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks after we filed. Caleb showed up looking like he'd lost sleep, playing the part of someone wronged. His lawyer tried to paint him as a longtime family friend who'd been suddenly cut off because I was jealous and controlling. Used those fake screenshots as evidence that Clara had encouraged his attention. Our lawyer was ready. Presented the timeline going back to college, Maya's testimony about his obsession, the surveillance folder, the escalating messages, and Daniel's analysis proving the screenshots were fabricated. The judge looked at Caleb's folder of Clara's photos, organized by year and date. Listened to the voice message where he said Clara was his. And asked Caleb directly why he'd been documenting another man's wife so thoroughly. Caleb stumbled through an answer about preserving memories of their friendship, but it sounded hollow, even to his own lawyer. This goes beyond friendship. This is obsessive monitoring, and the fabricated evidence suggests you're not grounded in reality about this relationship, the judge said, looking at the evidence spread across her desk. She granted a 3-year restraining order. No contact of any kind. No coming within 500 feet of us, our home, or Clara's workplace. No third-party communication. Caleb stared at us as we left the courthouse, and I could see he still didn't accept it. Still thought this was temporary, that Clara would come back to him once she saw reason. We went home and Clara finally broke down. Cried in a way she hadn't since this started. Said she felt stupid for not seeing it sooner. For letting him back in after college. For thinking his obsession had just been a phase. I told her that manipulation works because it's gradual. That Caleb had spent years normalizing his presence, making her doubt her own instincts, positioning himself as indispensable. We started therapy the following week. Both individual sessions for Clara and couples counseling for us. Her therapist specialized in helping people who'd been manipulated by long-term psychological mistreatment. Worked with Clara on understanding why she'd minimized Caleb's behavior, why she'd been afraid to enforce boundaries, why his attention had felt validating even when part of her knew it was wrong. I had conditions for staying in the marriage, and I made them clear from the start. Clara needed to stay in therapy, work on understanding her part in this, figure out why she'd valued Caleb's validation more than our relationship's health. We needed complete transparency, her phone and social media open to me until trust rebuilt. No private conversations with mutual friends who might pass information to Caleb. If you break the restraining order, if you contact him in any way, I'm done, I told her. And she agreed without hesitation. The first few months were hard. Clara had moments where she defended her past choices, where she tried to minimize what had happened. But her therapist kept bringing her back to reality. Slowly, she started seeing the patterns. How Caleb had exploited her guilt and empathy. How he'd made her responsible for his emotional state. How he positioned himself as the one person who truly understood her while systematically isolating her from recognizing how unhealthy their dynamic had become. We're 8 months past the restraining order now, and life feels different. Quieter. Like we're finally building something that's just ours. Caleb violated the order once. Showed up at Clara's workplace trying to deliver a letter and spent a night in jail before his lawyer got him out. The judge extended the restraining order another 2 years and warned him the next violation would mean serious jail time. Clara quit her adjuster position after that incident. Didn't want to risk him knowing her schedule or location. Found a remote position with a different insurance company. We moved to a different neighborhood where Caleb wouldn't know our routines. Didn't tell mutual friends our new address. Basically started fresh. We still have cameras, still check our surroundings, still save every blocked call or email that manages to get through, but the panic has faded into caution. Clara's therapist says she's made real progress. That she's learning to recognize manipulation patterns. To trust her instincts instead of explaining them away. To understand that kindness without boundaries isn't kindness at all. Our marriage isn't what it was 7 years ago. But maybe that's good. Maybe what we had before was built on ignoring problems instead of solving them. Now we have actual boundaries, real conversations about what we need, and space that belongs only to us without someone else's shadow filling it. The apartment feels bigger somehow now that it's just the two of us. Now that every photo on our wall is actually ours. Now that the person sitting next to Clara on the couch is the person who's supposed to be there. The real lesson here is that some people will exploit your kindness as permission to stay in your life long after they should have been gone. And the hardest part isn't recognizing the red flags. It's accepting that years of history don't justify tolerating behavior that makes you unsafe. Documentation saved this situation. Trusting my instincts despite being called controlling saved this situation. And understanding that, but we've been friends forever should never trump this person is obsessed with my spouse saved this marriage. Would you have caught the signs earlier, or would you have also dismissed them as overthinking?